What's up everyone? In today's video, we are going to talk about the 5 pillars of cloud using a simple example of a web application. Now, instead of starting with the security part first, I would like you to understand what are some of the common core components of building a web application. I want to specifically talk about this in the AWS space, and thankfully, I don't have to do this on my own. Fortunately for me, I have Amber from Tiny Technical Tutorials to talk about how would you build the core services of a web application in the AWS space. By the way, if you don't know Amber, she's, apart from being a great person, she also runs a channel called the Tiny Technical Tutorials. And if you're looking for a playlist for hands-on AWS learning, you should definitely check out the playlist that she has for Learn AWS or Learn Amazon Web Services on her channel, which is the Tiny Technical Tutorial. She has been talking about AWS for many years, and her channel is all about keeping it short and sweet. So this would be a great video with hands-on tutorial, which I would definitely recommend you check out. And because it's a collaboration between Cloud Security Podcast and the Tiny Technical Tutorial, the securing of a web application part will be on her channel, so definitely check out there and hit the subscribe button for when you go to her channel and support her, because she's doing an awesome work. And I would see you on her channel for how would you secure a web application in AWS. For now, take it away, Amber.
Hey everybody, Amber here. When you first start learning AWS, it can be a little bit intimidating, right? Maybe you can appreciate that. If you come into services and look at all of the services available, there's literally hundreds of things here, and it can be difficult to know where to focus and where to even start. So in this video, I'm going to focus on 5 core services that every beginner should know. Once you have those under your belt, then you can start tackling some of the others. So let's get started. What are those 5 core services? Well, let's suppose that you're building a super simple web application. Your users are in their browser, they go to www.mywebsite.com or whatever your domain name is. That traffic gets routed to a web server that hosts maybe a simple HTML page, maybe some JavaScript, maybe some backend code, whatever the functionality is. In most modern apps, there's probably also a database to store and retrieve data, and then you'll likely have other storage needs too, storing things like images, videos, documents, and so on. And we're just going to call that storage. These things live in a network, a container really, that's connected to the internet so that people can get there. And then there's also some kind of identity and access management system that governs who can create or modify things in the system. So very simple. Obviously, you need to get these pieces to talk to each other and so on. There's lots of ways to do that in AWS, but these are the basic components that almost all modern systems will have. So how does that translate into AWS? Let's start with Identity and Access Management, which in AWS is actually called Identity and Access Management, or IAM. It's a service that's used to securely control access to your resources. It controls authentication, or the who, and authorization, what they can do. Now, it's not so much about these users on the website, we'll cover more about that later, but more about what internal folks can do, like the developers working on the application. So how do you even get the application built and deployed in the first place? And how do these services talk to each other? Like, how does the web server have permissions to write things to a database and so on? Let's do a really quick tour of IAM in the AWS Console. So I'll navigate to IAM. And over here on the left, you'll see it starts with users. I can have users like Dwight Schrute or Pam Beasley. Those users can be part of a user group, which is basically a collection of users with the same permissions, something like admins, developers, or testers. You'll see these groups have permissions defined, and those are defined in policies. You'll see there's tons of policies here, over 1,100. Some of them are created for you out of the box, and you can also create your own policy. And then we also have roles. Roles are commonly used to give temporary access to services, like the web server that can write to the database, for example, like we saw earlier. So that's a whirlwind tour of IAM, but a super important service that really sits under everything else that you do in AWS. Now let's talk about the network part of things. In AWS, this is called the Virtual Private Cloud, or VPC. As you can imagine, there are hundreds of thousands, even millions of customers using AWS every day around the world. There's servers and databases and storage and a lot of other things out there, and you don't want your stuff just thrown in with everybody else's. Instead, you want your own private slice of the AWS pie overall, and that's basically what the Virtual Private Cloud is. It's how your resources get isolated from everybody else's. When you go to create an EC2 instance, this is your virtual server, just to give you a preview of what's coming up, you'll see here under Network Settings that you select your VPC, which in our case is the default. So if I were to go all the way through and launch this server, it would sit within our own little private network in AWS, again isolated from everybody else's resources. Okay, so we have the basics of IAM and the virtual private cloud. Now let's talk about these other things that live inside of the VPC. One of the most common services you'll be working with is Elastic Compute Cloud, or EC2. This essentially is a virtual server that you quote-unquote rent in AWS, rent meaning that you only use it when you need it, and you only pay for what you use. Rather than having a server sitting under your desk or in a back office somewhere, it lives in AWS. And in AWS speak, these are called instances. Let's head back to the console and finish what we started just a second ago. So here in the EC2 console, you can say launch instance, basically launch a server. We can give it a name, my first instance, and then we move down to the Amazon Machine Image, or AMI. An AMI is basically a pre-configured virtual machine that has things like the operating system and any other pre-installed software. Like maybe this should be a web server, or maybe you want to do something for machine learning, so it has frameworks like TensorFlow or PyTorch, that type of a thing. It's basically a template that you can use that can shorten the amount of time that you need to stand up a new machine. You basically start with this base image that has everything that you need on it. Just to keep things simple for our case, we're going to go with this Linux AMI here. This is free tier eligible, so if you're part of the free tier, this wouldn't cost you anything. There's other options here as well though, so you could choose those if it makes sense. Scrolling down, we have the instance type. So this has details like your CPU, your memory, and that type of thing. And you'll also see the pricing details as well as whether it's eligible for free tier. I'm going to stick with the free tier here, but there are other options. If you plan to connect to your instance, after it's created, you do need a key pair. You can create a new key pair here, or select one that was created previously if you've got one. For this short demo, I'm not going to connect, so I'll just say that I don't need a key pair for now, but just know that's what that's for. Coming down to Network Settings, we're going to put this in our default VPC, like we mentioned earlier. If you wanted to change that to something else, though, you can always edit these settings. And then there's a couple other important things to understand here. First is the security group. This is basically a set of firewall rules that will control traffic to and from your instance. So we can do things like allowing SSH traffic, allowing HTTPS traffic from the internet, or just HTTP traffic. These are the most common settings, and you can just toggle them here. Once again, if you want something else, you can come up to edit these settings, and you can specify different rules that make sense for your use case. There are several different protocols that you can specify in here, which should determine the port that's open. You can also say where the traffic is coming from. Is it from anywhere, from a specific IP, or some custom source? And then you can add additional security group rules as well. So those are very important and a common gotcha when it comes to connecting to your machines. For this demo, I'm going to add a rule to allow HTTP traffic, which will default us to port range 80 from anywhere, so that when the instance is set up, we'll be able to hit a web page on it. Okay, moving on. You've got settings around storage. This is basically your hard drive or your virtual hard drive that will be attached to your machine. You can get into advanced settings and change this to something else. I'm just going to go with the defaults though. And then finally, under advanced details, there's one other thing I'm going to do. Scrolling all the way down, there's this section for user data. Don't worry too much about the details here, but I'm going to enter a script that I want to run as soon as the instance is created. This particular script is going to install a web server on this machine and create an index.html page that says hello world and then the name of this particular machine. All right, so with those details filled in, let's say launch instance. This might take a couple of minutes, but once it's launched, we can go in and see that the web page is live on this server that we're creating. Okay, the instance is up and running. If I select it here, I'll get the details down below. Let's go check out that hello world page that we created. To do that, I can copy the public IPv4 address here, and then up on a new tab, I'll enter that address, and there's my hello world page. So really easy to get these servers up and running. You don't have to go buy your own hardware and set it up and all of that. It's literally just a few clicks in the console, and you're off and running. Now, if you were following along, you'll want to make sure to shut that instance down, just so you don't have any unexpected charges. I'm going to do that with my own here. Go to instance state and then terminate it, which will delete the instance and the hard drive associated with it. Okay, back to the slides. We've talked about compute. Next up we have storage. This is where you can store things like images or videos, documents, log files, and so on. In AWS land, this is called the Simple Storage Service, or S3. For all practical purposes, this is unlimited storage and also inexpensive. It's organized into buckets, which you can kind of think of as containers where you put your items. Or sort of like folders as well, even though they technically are not. But maybe you have a bucket for videos, a bucket for profile pictures, and so on. So let's go take a quick look at those in the console. I'll navigate to S3. And then we'll create a bucket. For bucket name, I'll go with Tiny Profile Pics. The name does have to be globally unique across all of AWS, so you might need to use a date or something like that if you find that your name is taken. I'll put this in the US West 2 region, and then I'm just going to leave the defaults for everything else. The default for public access is to block all public access. We could do a whole video around security on S3 buckets and objects, but keeping things simple for this demo, this is a best practice, and you can check out the Learn More here if you find that you need something else. But I'll just go with the default for everything else here, and we'll create the bucket. All right, success. We can go view the details here, which will take us to the bucket that we just created. There's currently nothing in it, no objects, but we can upload things. I'll just go upload a profile picture. I've got one here on my hard drive. I can just drag and drop it over here. We will upload. Success. So I'll close out of that message. Now if I click on that picture, the way that you open it here is with the Open button. And there's my profile picture. So really easy to work with buckets and objects, and this is an easy, inexpensive way to store things that your application might need. Okay, the last component for our super simple web application here is a database. In the land of databases, there's of course two big categories. One is relational, where your data is stored in a structured table. And then you've got non-relational databases that have a more flexible structure. These are sometimes called NoSQL databases. In AWS, the two popular options here are the Relational Database Service, or RDS, for relational. This allows you to pick from different engines, including MySQL, MariaDB, PostgreSQL, and others, so the most popular relational database engines. And then for non-relational, we have DynamoDB. This is a key value database, one of the more popular forms of NoSQL. If you're not familiar, it essentially works like this. You have a unique set of identifiers, which are the keys, and then each key has an associated value. So basically two pieces of data that are associated with each other. I'll just briefly show you how to get started with RDS, and then we'll go build out a simple table in DynamoDB. So back to the console, navigate to RDS if you need something relational. I won't go all the way through this one, but I'll just show you how to get started and how to pick the engine that you need. We'll create database. And then you basically just follow this wizard. You can do a standard create to choose all of the options yourself, or an easy create using recommended best practices. But here's the engines that I mentioned before. There is an instance that will run the database. You'll need to enter things like your password and so on, and then you can create the database. So that's for relational. That one does take a little bit more time to get set up, but I also want to show you DynamoDB for the NoSQL option. This one's really quick to get set up. We'll create a new table. Now notice we're not creating a new instance here, we're just creating a table. So this is a little bit more lightweight than RDS. I'll call this table customers. The partition key is going to be the table's primary key. In our case, we're going to say customer ID, which will be of type string. We can skip the sort key for now. We'll go with default settings on the table, and then create. And success. Now we can click into our customers table here. And if we say explore table items, we can look at the actual items in here. Obviously there's nothing here yet, but we can easily create an item here. There's no database to log into or anything like that, so super easy. We'll add a new attribute. Let's say this is one for first name. It'll be a string. First name is Art, and the customer ID up here, let's make this customer ID 1. We'll add another attribute for last name. Last name is Vandelay. We'll add just a couple other attributes here, one for city, New York City, and then one more for state of New York. So we'll create this item, and there you go. You'll see that the attributes basically make up our schema here. We didn't have to go predefine our schema or the relationships or anything like that you would have to do with a relational database. And the other cool thing here, if we go to create another item, we'll make this customer ID 2, and then just add a couple of other things. You'll see that we can actually add different types of attributes here. But first, let's start with first name and last name like we had before. And then rather than city and state, we could do something like adding a number for age of 62. We can create that item. And that item can live right alongside the one that we had before, which didn't have age, but it had city and state. So this works just fine in a non-relational database. It's a very flexible way to store your data. So back to our big picture, there you have it, the 5 core services for AWS. If you want to learn more about any of these, check out the links in the description for more in-depth videos. And there's also videos about things like API Gateway, the Simple Queue service, Lambda, and so on, which will let these different services talk to each other. But those are the core services to know as you're getting started. I hope you found this helpful as you start your learning journey in AWS. Thank you so much for watching.